let me reiterate that I think there is a complete divorce between where markets are and where the world is right now. We do not live in normal times in terms of politics, and markets still keep trying to pretend we live in normal times for markets. But the underlying logic that I see still says, yeah, there's huge volatility ahead, and a bit further big shocks to come.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm its founder and your host, Adam Taggart. Today's guest predicted years in advance the shift away from globalization towards nationalism by the world's major countries. Well, now that the previous unipolar globe is in the process of fracturing into multiple power and trading blocks, what does he see next? Well, to find out, let's ask the man himself. We're very fortunate to sit down again today with michaelevery, global strategist at Rabobank. Michael, thanks so much for joining us all the way from Thailand.
Very good to be here again.
All right, I appreciate you saying that. I know this is actually a tough one for you because A, it's early in your morning, but B, really, you woke up right before you were going to come on this show and looked at your X account and saw the nuclear war that has been kicked off between Elon Musk and America's President Donald Trump. I know that you have to get going to make sense of that for yourself and for all your followers in the world. I'm not going to get into that too much with you here today, just because this thing is unfolding in real time. By the time this video launches, I'm sure wherever it is right now will be old news. But I just want to acknowledge that you've had a big distraction thrown in your lap right before coming on camera here. And I appreciate you making the time, given all that, to still talk to this audience.
You're very kind. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure it will be peppered through what we're going to discuss, but it's a little bit of a broadside to get. I mean, there's lots of other news overnight too, but it's it's been a bit of a surprise, isn't
it? and there's even breaking news as we're talking here. Literally, it looks like Russia might be actually beginning its retaliation wave for the drone strike on Russia's bombers. I mean, there's just my first question for you here, which I wrote down, Michael, was where to even start. I mean, there's so much going on, but at a very high level, we can start wherever you want. But you and I have done interviews now for a number of years. The world is accelerating along the trajectory that you've been predicting. And when we first started talking, I think for a lot of people, mercantilism, this sounds like a kind of very highly academic type of thing. Now, mercantilism, nationalism, protectionism, et cetera, has very quickly become the rule of the land and an increasing number of countries around the world. So let me just ask you this to kick things off. From your globalism to mercantilism standpoint, how would you describe the state of the world today?
Wow. Okay. Great question to start. In flux, I think, would be the best description. There's a much more eloquent version of that, which I'll probably stumble over now, which is embarrassing.
No worries.
From Gramsci.
Let me. I've got two other questions, and so
okay.
Let me just ask them, and then you can kind of craft whatever answer you like.
Sure.
The first one is, in your opinion right now, which trends of everything going on are the most important ones to keep our eyes on? And then secondly, because you're the man who predicted all of this, is there anything going on right now that's truly surprising to you? So feel free to weave any and all of those in your answer.
Okay, thank you. I'll try and weave them all in together. So I think the phrase I was about to garble from Gramsci, 20th century revolutionary, still fits for all of them, which is when the new is waiting to be born and the old refuses to die, monsters appear. And there are various different kind of iterations of that quote that apply. It's heavily used in the political sciences. And the old clearly does refuse to die, even if it keeps saying build back better or whatever the latest iteration is. And the new clearly is struggling to be born. And you can see flux all around you as a result. And my methodology, and I was talking about this actually yesterday, is that you have to go back to those high-level first principles, like what is mercantilism versus globalization, which you and I were discussing a few years ago. Because if you don't understand what the ideological rules of the game you're playing are. Like, I'm allowed to do X. I mean, let's say, for example, you're playing Monopoly. Do you have to go twice around the board before you start buying property, or just once? You change that rule. If one player is playing the game one way and someone else is playing it another, you can pretty much predict, even given the vagaries of the dice and where you land, who's more likely to win. You'd agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So that's pretty much the methodology. I try and look and see what are the rules of the game. What are we agreeing we're allowed to do, or we're not allowed to do? And then I try and look at the pressure points that build up that suggest you might get a rule change. For example, I might know that this person absolutely is determined to win at all costs and can find a clause written in the 18th century that says I'm allowed to. So they'll shift to that set of rules, and everyone else will say no. I prefer this set of rules published in America in the 1930s or whatever. And so they'll stick with that version. It sounds obscure, but it really is a foundation for understanding where you're going to see people pivot, then how the rules change, and then after that, how the random, and they are still random, events will fall along those lines and what the more likely outcomes are. So let's go back to the Musk news. Let's go back to what you've just told me that I hadn't heard until a moment ago about Russia perhaps starting its retaliation against Ukraine. There are certain fundamental factors that you could point to on both fronts, and a common one running through them both. So the fundamental factors with Musk and Trump, obviously two men with very large egos, probably both on the spectrum, as they say, and both pretty narcissistic, big men in politics, shall we say, and business. And yet fundamentally, Musk is a radical libertarian who was, of course, very happy to take a state EV mandate to help him sell more cars, but is, a true believer in libertarian causes. Trump may have libertarian leanings in terms of free speech, particularly because it suits him at the moment. But he is, to use that word we were just using, a neo-mercantilist, which means you have to use all the power of the state to try and shift your relative position in the global trading system. That was always going to clash. Always. So then you add the personalities, the egos on top. It was a question of when, not if, that would blow up. And clearly that one's blowing up. And talking of blowing up, I mean, Russia and Ukraine obviously is ongoing. And so there's no real surprise that Russia is retaliating there. The issue that runs through both the Musk-Trump thing and Russia-Ukraine, and through the Middle East and through South Asia and through East Asia, where, of course, we've just had Trump and Xi talking by phone as well and saying one is going to visit the other. So we're going to have two high-level state visits. Is the new is struggling to be born while the old refuses to die. We are seeing a variety of unpleasant frictions, and that's a really euphemistic way of putting it, given what Russia-Ukraine is and what's happening in the Middle East, between the likely borders of potential new political economic geographies between blocks. So Russia-Ukraine is one. Is Ukraine in the Russian bloc, which is what Russia wants, or is it in the European bloc, and then is Europe in the Western bloc with America or not? Those are intersecting frictions. In South Asia, India, Pakistan, we recently had that mini war there. Is India with the Western bloc, or trying to do its own thing, or in BRICS? The Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, is that going to see some kind of regional Pax Americana within this new global bloc, with staying in the dollar system? Or is Iran going to try and bring the whole thing down? And does Israel attack Iran and chaos for energy prices, etc., etc.? And of course, East Asia, where everyone keeps talking about certain well-known flashpoints, which I'm sure will be part of the discussion between Trump and Xi, even if they're supposed to be talking tariffs only. All of these are live and in the background, and they are all part of this game. And so when the market just keeps talking about tariffs, that's such a reductivist, naive way to see what's actually going on. Yes, tariffs matter, but they're part of an economic strategy that sits alongside a military one and a political one to try and create this new from the old.
That's a great start to this. And for folks that haven't seen my previous interviews here with Michael, I'll try to do a real concise description, and then you can correct everything I say incorrectly, Michael. um, but just to understand what mercantilism is, if that's a new word to you, globalism obviously was the era that kind of got kicked off post uh, the dismantling of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the USSR, and it really was the world trying to come together and play much more nicely together and become much more united, right? Free trade with everybody as close as we could get there. And we're all one big world, as you would say, Michael. It's sort of the Star Trek vision of the world. Mercantilism is much more sort of every country for itself. Now, there's lots of alliances of convenience that happen in there, but the primary motivator is what's best for me and my own, right? And so that's much more the Star Wars analogy, right? Where it's empire builders, it's take what you can from the strong, take from the weak, all that type of stuff. And as I heard you talking about, kind of the differences between, like Musk's ideology and Trump's ideology, and certainly this can be applied to it certainly can be applied to globalists versus mercantilists, is the globalists is much more of an ideal and it's a way of doing things, where I think the means are the most important thing, the principles that we live by, where the mercantilist is the end justifies the means, which is I'll do whatever I got to do as long as I accomplish what I want to do. So if I've got to break free markets, if I've got to take away civil liberties, if I've got to break an alliance, all that's fair game. Did I do an okay job of kind of distilling it all?
You did. I will only quibble on the very last part because I think there's an equally ruthless agenda from both sides. From the globalist side, and that's used as a pejorative now by some, obviously. If you look at the clear track record, everyone is prepared to break heads and break things in order to achieve that ideal system. How many times have you seen a country voting the wrong way and then the election result ends up being different? And I don't mean interference. I mean what the politicians end up saying. Rejecting closer
I mean,
integration and
I
then
guess
having
you could point just to what was it, Romania, where they had the election and then the EU just
yeah,
nullified it. We didn't like the
yeah,
outcome, sorry.
yeah, yeah. Okay, that's a very, 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 very blatant recent example. But the whole point is that if you have an ideal system, and globalism was an ideal system, an ideological project, that this is the right way to do things, and it had flaws, by the way. Every ideology does. That's the problem. If we had one true ideology that solved all problems and explained everything in real time for everyone and managed to deal with all of our issues at once, we'd all be that ideology. Surely we can't be that stupid to have the real revealed truth sitting on the table in front of us and someone say, "Nah, I don't want that." So globalism thought it had the answers. It didn't. We've seen that in the past, as I've told you before. It just creates domestic inequality and international inequality between, those running a trade surplus and those running a trade deficit. And so it broke down. But while we were trying to implement it, the ideological true believers didn't want to hear that, and they would steamroller it over to make sure they got what they wanted. Now, neo-mercantilists, they are absolutely saying the ends justifies the means, but they're not doing that out of a willingness to put on a Darth Vader helmet and get a red lightsaber and just go around hacking and slashing at everything they see. I mean, they can do, but genuinely, a neo-mercantilist, and it's important to understand this, they see themselves as the rebels, or they see themselves as the resistance. They see themselves at the wrong end of the stick. They are the ones losing jobs. They are the ones totally rely on others. Like, do you remember the Phantom Menace? Here we go. Star Wars Episode 1. You and I are old enough to remember seeing it in the movies. The taxation of trade routes is in dispute. There you go. That's literally a mercantilist issue that we're saying, why are we at the wrong end of this particular trade issue? Why don't we have any starships that control our cargo being lifted off of our planet? Why don't we have any technology that's important and we have to wait for the update from you and you can charge whatever you want? That's the neo-mercantilist argument. I want a bit of power back. I want a bit of dignity. I want a bit of sovereignty. So both sides see themselves as the good guys in this.
Oh, all right. Well, super interesting. Okay. Well, anyway, so Michael, I think if you took somebody from a year ago and teleported them to today and told them kind of what had happened along the way, I don't think they would have believed you. Just in terms of the volume of change, both inside America itself, but also just around the world. I was just creating a list here of kind of, nationalist election surprises, that we've seen around the world. Obviously, we had Milei there in Argentina, and that was, about a year ago, maybe a little bit more. But then we had Meloni in Italy. We just had Karol Nawrocki. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's the new Polish premier that just got elected, surprise election. We've had AfD become, I think, the most popular party now in Germany, even though the rest of the, even though the rest of the galactic empire in Germany is trying to basically kick them out of the federation. I'm mixing my metaphors here. We've obviously, well, a similar thing happened in France with Marine Le Pen, right? She was becoming, a very large force there, and then now they're trying to use lawfare there to make her not be able to run. Just what was it yesterday? Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, his party, the Party for Freedom, just left the coalition government, which basically has turned it into a lame duck government. We've seen, similar rise of nationalist parties and elsewhere in Europe, like Portugal and Croatia. Obviously, the U.S. elected President Trump. We've had Viktor Orban there in Hungary as a big nationalist. This sort of academic thesis you had has all of a sudden like just exploded onto the world here. Is this going to continue to be a rising tide from here, or is this, to go back to our Star Wars analogy, is this the rebels' first foray before the Empire strikes back and tries to pound them back into oblivion?
The Empire will certainly try to strike back, and it has done in several locations already. But I do think we're going to end up with the return of the Jedi, because the fundamental drivers of that process are going nowhere. Because to go back to the old refuse to die, well, the new are waiting to be born. The new are waiting to be born because the old don't know what they're doing. That's the problem. So the credentialed acronym elite that we have globally, with all these different institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, Bank for International Settlements, who I do have a lot of time for, by the way. You know the kind of folks I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. This global architecture. They, like any bureaucracy, think they know what they're doing, but of course, over time, start to act more in their own self-interest as much as anything else. That's just a natural process that happens in any bureaucracy. But they don't have the answers to the deep-rooted inequalities and imbalances that you see within the global system that they're insistent on building. And let me just pivot for 1 second before I come back to that. You forgot the UK, which is also interesting, where I'm from originally, where last year we had a left-wing government elected because the previous right-wing government had been such an abject failure in not being a right-wing government, even though that's what everyone had voted for. And because of the way our election system works in the UK, we have the largest, strongest government majority for 100 years, if not more. It's an incredibly strong government, and yet from day one it started to fail in terms of trying to implement what it thought was sensible, centrist, technocratic, pro-global policies, but with softer edges, which is how they always think they can do it. And the opinion polls now, the Reform Party from Nigel Farage, a friend of Donald Trump's, who is perhaps the British version of Trump, that's the easiest way to sum him up, he's currently decimating them in the opinion polls. And the previous Conservative Party government, which is the world's most successful political party, they've been around for 200 years in various different forms. They're close to extinction. Literal extinction now at the next election. And although we've got 4 years to go, 3 or 4, probably 4, everyone is now starting to take seriously the fact that we could have a complete outsider and a political party that didn't even exist a few years ago, and which has got almost no roots whatsoever in British society, could win a thumping majority, which would be an incredible turn-up. But let me go back to the bigger picture. That's happening because this attempt to try and say, okay, we knew we were wrong, let's try and tweak it, doesn't work because you can't tweak it. It can't be tweaked. That doesn't mean the other side have all the answers. I'm not saying that either. I said there's no one ideology that gets everything right. but it's not anything that's tweakable. You can't put lipstick on a pig or on an elephant and say it isn't a pig and it isn't an elephant. It's still what it is. And if you don't believe me, and as a bellwether of where we are, 2 days ago we had an opinion piece in the Financial Times, which is, no offense to Americans, but still like the world's leading international financial paper rather than the Wall Street Journal. Much despite the fact that it puts a lot of silly stuff in of late. Anyway, they had an opinion piece written by Larry Fink, who I'm sure I don't need to introduce, in which he said globalization is over and we need a new draft which doesn't have all the imbalances in it. So we don't need the large trade surpluses and the trade deficits. Mm-hmm. We need more local capital circulating, so it's better for workers. Oh my goodness. Let me just take another 30 seconds to unpack that. If you have that.
Sorry, before you do, just for maybe the few folks who didn't get the Larry Fink reference, this is a CEO of BlackRock. This is not the workers' champion normally.
Yeah. I mean, so you've got the BlackRock CEO saying we need a new version of globalization. But here's the kicker. And I think he himself doesn't get this, although he understands which way the wind is blowing. If you have a system that you tweak, which is what he's talking about, let's keep globalization without the surpluses and the deficits. So, for example, you don't have a huge trade surplus in China and in Germany and in Japan and in South Korea, just to give the key examples. And therefore, you don't have the big deficits in the US or in the UK or in Australia, et cetera, and the Anglosphere. You can't have the big capital flows that go on the back of that too.
Right.
Which is an issue we're seeing playing out in US markets, and hopefully we'll come to logically in a few minutes. So that upends not just real physical supply chains, who makes what where. It upends currencies, and it upends capital markets, whether it's things like US treasuries or government bonds in other countries, or equities, because they're obviously assets too. And here's the other kicker. And this is where one needs to understand how balance sheets work and how they intersect, which is also a very powerful methodology. If you're saying that, by very definition, you are also saying you have to have less inequality in your country. Because the fact that you have huge trade surpluses in some countries means there isn't enough domestic consumption there. They're producing a lot of stuff. They're not buying it. Why aren't they buying it? Because they're not paying their people enough. It doesn't mean the wages are low necessarily, but their overall income is being suppressed. They're not getting a big share of the pie. The pie sits there and they sell the pie to someone else. And in the importing country, let's call it America, because it usually is, you're importing that pie and you can only do it by borrowing. Well, guess what? In that system, Mr. Fink, the people who lend the money tend to do very well, and the people who borrow the money tend to do very badly. So you get more inequality and unhappiness and polarization and Donald Trumps over time. So if you're going to have a new globalization without that, you're talking about a more equal, genuinely in a kind of like socially focused sense, more disruptive for capital markets and more disruptive for physical supply chains, economy. And Larry Fink just said that's what we need because the other one's over. I dropped the microphone at that point.
Well, let me say that this same sentiment was echoed on this channel recently by Lacey Hunt. So that's good company to be in, Michael. And to the point you made, he just said, "Look, we got to be aware that if we intentionally reduce the account surpluses that we run with these countries, then that is going to reduce the amount of foreign capital that comes in the United States, buys our treasuries, invests in our assets and stuff like that. I mean, there's a real cost to that, which, you might call that a second order effect, and most people just think of the first order effects. But it's something that you totally ignore to your peril here. So, what's interesting about that, Michael, is from our previous discussions, I've asked you, given, your understanding of mercantilism and which countries are positioned with their relative strengths and disadvantages on the global chessboard, which countries do you think are best positioned? And if I'm remembering correctly, America was very high on that list, if not at the top. I would think if we were to intentionally embrace this type of tweak to globalism that you think Larry Fink is advocating for, that actually wouldn't be in America's interest, right?
Well, again, the question becomes, and it's ideological, what do we mean by America's interests?
Yeah, you're right. I should have answered that better. Um, well, okay. How would that strengthen America's position on the board? Let me ask it that way.
Well, it depends how it's done, first of all, what the strategy is and how it's implemented. And we can have a whole discussion about that. But I think it's important to begin with the counterfactual. Let's say we don't, which is the default position of all the credentialed elite who want this all to go away and who are now, of course, making jokes about Taco Tuesday, that Trump always chickens out, and
Right.
increasingly pricing for the fact that it will all just go away because this madness can't be real. Okay, so then you have a situation in which US assets can continue to do well. And obviously, I know viewers will be thinking, okay, that sounds good for me. But you are talking about the increased Brazilification and emerging marketification of the US, where the poor will get poorer and angrier. Society will continue to disintegrate. The rich will be more and more distanced from their own country, culturally, physically, financially. And the physical supply chains within the US, which are a real issue in this, will become existential. So within no time at all, I can't tell you how many years, but it would happen, the US wouldn't be able to maintain the current military that it has, not at the size that it does. It wouldn't be able to maintain even things like auto production without the rare earths, which China currently monopolizes, which every economist said, yeah, this is fine, while drinking coffee, while watching China take control of an input that's needed for every major industry, as a monopoly, and thinking they'll never use that against us because markets, whilst never having read anything about mercantilism or politics. And so the US would find itself in a position where it would lose the ability to project power, to have the kind of geopolitical muscle that it does now, short of just saying, look, we'll nuke everybody, which is a ridiculous negotiating stance. You couldn't be doing that to everyone all the time, right? That's just silly. And it would gradually start to rot from the inside. So it would look like a huge tree that's very, very powerful on the outside, but rotting on the inside, which, if I remember correctly, and I'm really stretching here, is some of the language that was used in the original novel of Star Wars back from the 1970s about how the Galactic Empire, how the Galactic Republic turned into the Empire. It was a giant tree which was strong but rotted from the inside. Yeah.
All right. Well, look, then I hand Star Wars arcane knowledge to you, my friend. You've just exceeded my understanding. So let me ask you this then. So okay, so obviously, in terms of the new struggling to be born, that the growing wealth disparity in America is what basically led to Donald Trump, right, being in office, right? He ran on this very populist platform, very much again, sort of the Star Wars rebellion. Here's all the ways we're getting screwed, but really talking to the average person and saying, look, you're taking the brunt of this. I want to bring America back to the old days where the working class could afford a middle class lifestyle. A lot of questions are on this, but I guess let me start with this one. How would you rate him? How would you grade Trump and his policies so far from the mercantilist playbook? I'm not asking you to say whether it's good or bad, but just as a Joe mercantilist, how is Trump doing so far?
Okay. To answer that question, I first of all have to qualify just slightly. Mercantilists or neo-mercantilists, the newer version, they're not all cut from the same cloth. For example, that they can have an aim of, right, I just want to build power, or they can say, I need to redistribute income while I'm rebalancing things. So they can have a social focus or no social focus. They can be politically liberal in the broadest sense, or they can be illiberal. They can be economically liberal in the sense of saying, I want markets to do the work as much of the time as possible. Or they can be economically illiberal, which is I want the state to run everything as much as possible. So there's like a 2x2 grid, and I've tried to place Trump within that in the past. So I'll share it with you afterwards. The work, maybe you can put it in the link for viewers. I think when you do that as a historical taxonomy and look at all the other mercantilists, because there have been many of them, Trump has echoes with one from the 19th century, from Germany in particular, one called Schmoller, I think, and one called List, who actually became an American in the end. And if you look at everything that List said you should do, if you list, if you will, he's not doing badly in terms of hitting all the right points, but he's going to fall short in a few key areas until we see more flesh put on some of the bones. For example, a very obvious one, he dived into the tariff war without getting everything lined up in terms of have I stocked up on rare earths, etc., etc. Like he should definitely have stockpiled a few things before beginning this, or that would have been ideal, because you don't want to go into a war with no bullets ready. But secondly, and a crucial point, if Trump is economically liberal, which we can see he is, he would like the market to do things rather than the state in general. Most past mercantilists recognize that at some point you were going to need something like a national investment bank or a national infrastructure bank, or the first Bank of America. Even Alexander Hamilton thought that. You needed a financing vehicle to make sure that the projects that were good for America Inc. would always be financed at low interest rates. This is going to come back to a point you and I have discussed in the past many times. Mm-hmm. While the private sector could take care of whatever it wanted to at a higher interest rate for things that weren't such a priority.
Yep.
And we have discussed that, differential interest rates, which is really coming back as a thing everywhere. Right. So I don't see the vehicle.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we did have the proposal a few months ago of a sovereign wealth fund for America. Haven't heard much about it since, but
there you go. You see, now that's exactly my point. So the sovereign wealth fund, I think, and again, using my methodology, which is what's really happening here in terms of ideology, fair enough. Who else has thought similarly to that in the past in similar situations? How did they do it? What are we doing today that's similar or different? What they did is have a much earlier, quicker understanding of the fact that capital is going to have to flow, and Wall Street isn't going to do the job in the modern parlance. I mean, how many times has Ascent said the focus is Main Street, not Wall Street?
Right.
In recent months. A lot. Okay, so how does Main Street get the money? How does Main Street get that ability? And if it's a liberal interpretation, which is, well, if we just deregulate, it will take care of itself. That is as naive domestically as the international version is saying, well, if we just have globalization, everyone will be okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's replicating that error between winners and losers on a domestic scale. So the sovereign wealth fund, which again we've had no details on, could well be the answer. And I'm not sure if I've shared this with you. I may have. No one knows quite how it will work. But if you think in a traditional economic sense, like your credentialed elite and all the economists, that I rub shoulders with outside my own team internationally, they'll say you can't have a sovereign wealth fund in the US. How can you? You haven't got any government savings. You have a deficit. You haven't got any national savings because you have a current account deficit. So it's a twin deficit situation. Where's this wealth? And I say to them, you don't understand how this is going to work as a mercantilist in a Trumpian sense, if they really want to make this work, which is you'll take a piece of land somewhere in the States, let's say somewhere in North or South Dakota. You'll say it's worth $6 billion because it probably is. It's just sitting there as a piece of federal land.
Mm-hmm.
You'll go to Wall Street with a gun in your pocket and you'll tell them, I'd like to leverage this up 10 times, please. So it's worth 60 billion. And then you give $1 million to everyone in Greenland. 60,000 people in Greenland.
Right. I've made this point before. We could make the Greenlanders millionaires if we really want to get access to that. Their minerals.
Yeah, I mean, this is an extreme example because you can also build infrastructure in the US. There are lots of things you can do. But the point is you're going to have to use American financialization, which is what your economy is built on now, rather than physical production. It used to be physical production. It's now financialization. It's Wall Street, not Main Street.
Yeah.
You'll have to temporarily use Wall Street against Wall Street to reverse that process. The only alternative is to have a state-owned investment bank, which will just lend low-interest money to key projects, which effectively will never be paid back.
Mm-hmm.
That loan is never going to make money. That infrastructure will never make money. But if you grow the economy enough on the back of it, 20 years from now, the loan that you'll write off is small beer compared to the growth that you got from it. So it's a fixed cost that you're pretending isn't really going to be a fixed cost. And by the way, Europe is now about to do this on defense. Europe's going to set up an infrastructure bank for defense, or an investment bank just for defense lending. And of course, defense is notoriously very profitable. And I mean, it can be in the US, of course, but generally speaking, it's not something that, you make that much money from overall as a country,
Right.
but it needs to be done. So I've given a long answer. Apologies. I didn't mean to take so much time.
No, it's good. I'm just going to ask a follow-up on it then, which is, look, I think from, an outsider's point of view, Trump has deployed a very disruptive, very mercantilist set of policies way faster than I think almost anybody could have imagined, right? And he disrupted global trade way faster than anybody expected, way more disruptively than anybody expected, maybe too fast and too disruptive from your earlier points on here. He's pushing deregulation hard. He's trying to lower taxes. We've got the big, beautiful bill. That's a whole other, fight that's going on inside America right now. He has been, true to his campaign promises about slamming shut the border and starting to deport people who got here illegally. So, kind of going down this list, including sovereign wealth fund, including saying, hey, I want Greenland, including saying, hey, Canada, you should become our 51st state. I mean, who knows how he's going to deliver on any of these things, and we can certainly debate the execution of these. But these goals seem to me to be very much like, hey, if you think it's time for mercantilism, this guy is really trying to play the playbook.
Thank you. Now you've framed it like that. Yes. Sorry, and apologies for having taken a long time to go into the execution. Yeah, the box ticking exercise so far is bang on, but the delivery of them, the implementation, and crucially, how they join up, which was a real problem with the old global system of one policy would run to the left, one policy would run to the right. They ran against each other. In mercantilism, they have to all work together because, you can't make a fist from your forefingers and your thumb if they're not actually coordinating. And it's a fist that you're trying to make effectively out of your digits.
That's a great analogy. That's a great analogy. Well, look, where I'm trying to go with this, and I have the tough challenge of trying to contain this conversation to more or less an hour, where I feel like I could take 6 hours with you to really give it justice. But is kind of back to my earlier question to you about, like, if you look at the risk board and you say, hey, whose prospects look best, whose prospects look worst, given where we are right now. Like I said, if I remember from our past conversations, you thought that America definitely very well positioned, China not so much, Russia definitely not, Europe definitely not, or at least its prospects look pretty grim. Has anything happened since we last talked, given the fact that we've had all this change I mentioned earlier, especially Trump, and now that we have a greater sense of both what his policies are, but his way of going on and enacting them? Has your overall kind of, uh, sport scouting book changed at all? Or do you think America still looks like it's got the best shot here? Or is there somebody else who's maybe looking like they're going to be the MVP?
It's a great way of putting it. Again, I would still say on balance, America. What I would say is that it's crucial, clearly, that the implementation has to be carried out correctly. You can have the best plays in the world, but if you fumble time and time again, if your receiver has got butterfingers, then it's not going to help you get that touchdown. And that's, by the way, that was a real stretch for me as a Brit to try and make it an American-centric sport
And you
analogy.
made it very well. Congratulations. Much better than if I tried a cricket analogy, say.
Well, me too, actually. I'm not much of a cricket player, but yeah. So that is important to stress. But I think in terms of the strategic position, America actually is in a better position now than it looks, because I understand why markets aren't happy. And the interesting corollary to this is that you can have America achieving a better strategic position and markets still selling off. So like the S&P or the Dow could tumble again back into a bear market, and you'd have all the financial press pulling their hair out, and it wouldn't necessarily mean a thing in terms of how America is positioning itself in this great game. Not a thing. And that's a really important distinction to make, because the stock market is no longer the bellwether indicator of how the game's being played. But let me just...
That's a great point. Let me just make this point so you can incorporate
Sure.
it in your answer,
Sure.
which is I'm so glad you mentioned that, because there are a lot of people, for reasons that are totally valid, and I share many of them, who fear that the markets could go through a pretty big correction here. One, because valuations are very rich. Two, for much more fundamental issues and concerns about the debt and the currency. What's going on trade-wise right now. There's just a whole bunch of reasons for why the market could correct hard, maybe even crash. And there's a fair amount of those people who think, and then that's it, America's over, right? And I think what you're saying is more, look, market cycles come and go. Given this grand game that we're talking about, to your point, it's almost immaterial what the markets do in the short term, in terms of the long term of the grand game.
It is. I would add that it's perhaps inevitable that markets have to sell off to some degree, or at least shift the composition in terms of what's doing well and what isn't, which is something else we've discussed in the past. If we're agreeing with Larry Fink, that we need to have an economy where literally the bottom 4 income deciles do really well and the top 2 don't, because most of American consumption is driven now by the top 2 income deciles and very little by the bottom 4. And if you reverse that around the other way, things look pretty different in terms of what does well and what doesn't. But that transition would certainly seem, some stocks hit hard. And again, I don't give any investment advice, so I'm being very generic in my description there, and others do well. So that transition, I think, is absolutely baked into the cake if it's going to be achieved. But whether we see market turbulence or not, that has to be divorced from how is America on the board actually playing the game well. And even if, and we haven't talked about this, but it's a subset of that, you get more headlines saying, look at the American 30-year bond yield. Look at the 30 US Treasury going through 5%. People don't want to hold long US debt. Well, I was reading those headlines and I was saying, have you seen what Japan's doing?
Yeah.
Have you seen what the UK is doing?
I've asked this question, like, okay, you don't like US debt. Whose debt are you gonna own? Who looks better?
Well, I mean, people would turn around and say, okay, in a financial metric like that, China, so their 30-year yield for what it's worth, literally for what it's worth, has tumbled. Does that mean China is winning the game? No, it doesn't. It means that the structures that we based everything around, which were markets first and foremost, are breaking down. That is going to be an inflation shock in the interim, but there are economic statecraft mechanisms that will kick in, mercantilist mechanisms that will kick in to compensate for that. And so then you have to look at, again, the bigger picture, which is who's winning on this game. And let me just spend 60 seconds quickly just to give you an update on that.
Sure, please.
I mentioned the let's call them trigger points, to use like a muscular analogy for the body politic, the international body politic. So we have them in Europe, obviously, Eastern Europe. We have them in the Middle East. We have them in South Asia. We have them in East Asia. And while there are slight wins and losses, being registered across geographies, there is potentially in Eastern Europe, Trump obviously is going to walk away from Ukraine at some point. This war, based on what you told me, 45 minutes ago, is clearly not going to get any better. Europe are going to be the ones stepping up to do that. So Europe are going to be rearming, and they'll be dealing with Russia. What that means for Europe is a whole separate conversation, but that's going to be a front America doesn't have to worry about, but the Europeans and the Russians will be worried about each other.
Yep.
South Asia, India was on the cusp of signing a trade deal with the US, I believe. And then, of course, we had the issue with Pakistan, which I don't think was a coincidence in the slightest. Color me, conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat guy, if you will. But we had the same thing happening in the Middle East just before Saudi Arabia was about to sign up to the Abraham Accords, which would, of course, expanded an India, Middle East, Europe trade corridor. And suddenly Hamas attacks Israel on October the 7th. And subsequently, we have seen intelligence documents saying, yes, they found proof. That was one of the reasons why they did it at that particular juncture. I mean, they wanted to anyway, but the juncture was perfect for it.
Yeah.
But in the Middle East, for all the horrible mess that's going on there, we are on the cusp of America either doing some kind of deal with Iran, which, while it could be just Trump echoing Obama, with real problems further down the line, would potentially bring everyone under one umbrella there and allow for that India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which will bring down energy prices as a quid pro quo and have that as a real boom region going forward rather than that boom and the explosive sense.
Right. And just to note, he did come back from the Gulf the other week with a lot of, deal agreements from the Saudis and the UAE and a lot of other places. So it seems ripe for something good to happen if they can solve the Iran issue.
Oh, completely. And by the way, that's a huge issue. You could talk for an hour just on that. But those deals he came back with were real. The money may be slightly fantastical because it depends on X, Y, Z, etc. But the fact that the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudi, the UAE in particular, with all their oil, made it 100% clear we were in the US camp, not the Chinese camp. Massive win, which was completely underplayed by people who don't understand this game. So then you pivot to Asia, and now we've got a state visit to China and Xi Jinping visit to the US. Now, who knows what we're going to see from those? I'm very skeptical because, that's the key pivot point to the whole thing. I'm skeptical that there'll be an easy out. But if we're going to have any new modus vivendi, this is mine, that's yours, lines on a map, agreements on how things have to be done, this is likely to be the platform it could be.
Those guys need to meet. Yeah. Without those guys meeting to make it happen, probably nothing's going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. And you get that, and then you get, a couple of trade deals done. Let's say, for example, if the US can get that one done with India, which, they haven't helped themselves with in terms of how they dealt with the recent clashes with Pakistan. India wanted to see something different than what they saw. But if they can rebuild those bridges and get India on board, Japan will follow. The UK is already on board. And once you start getting dominoes toppling, others topple. So everything's in flux. As circling back, everything we saw with Elon Musk shows that alliances can collapse where there are ideological clashes, but equally they can suddenly emerge. Who saw Musk and Trump 12 months ago, right?
Right. Michael, sorry, let me just start to interrupt again, but just on this really important point. So flux is the dominant factor right now. Couldn't agree more. But if I had to ask you to for your odds of an outcome, let me take 1 second and just tell you how I have referred to these, Trump's intense tariff or heavy-handed tariff approach. I felt seeing how this unfolded, it was hard for me not to come to the conclusion that Trump said, look, I got to get everybody on Team America versus China as fast as possible. And I've only got 4 years. I don't have enough time to play nice with everybody and do all the kitten herding to try to get everybody on the same page and then go after China as a united front the nice way. What I got to do is find a quick way to do it. And the way I think he did it is say, look, I think I got the best hand at the poker table right now. So I'm going to call everybody. Everybody show your cards, right? If you get a better hand than me, great. But if you don't, I've got the better hand. Let's negotiate some trade deal. You're going to give me some gives, but I'm going to try to give you some carrots too. But part of that process is that you're agreeing to be on Team America versus China so that we can place maximum pressure on China in the near term. Is that analogy accurate in any way, shape, or form, do you think? And B, is it, despite all the flux and the dust in the air and the frustration and the uncertainty, is it more than not likely to work?
100%. That's what he did. You're absolutely right. And 99% is going to work. Because for all that the other card players are huffing and puffing and saying, well, I'm going to go to another casino. No, they're not. The only other casino they can go to is, run by the mafia guy around the corner who sits there with a machete on the table, with a big cigar in his mouth, with a string vest, etc.
Mhm.
You don't want to play. You don't want to play in that casino. You certainly don't get nice free drinks to loosen you up while you're playing, right? It's not a very nice environment. So, yes, you've hit the nail on the head completely.
Okay. So if that does actually work, and I'm trying to get back to your point of saying you think America should have, despite the dust in the air right now, may still have the better hand. How do you expect America's prospects to change or be improved if and when that's all resolved and it's like, yeah, okay, we've created all these great trade deal or at least these better trade deals with a lot of our key allies, and we've forced China to come to the table and agree to something that is, at least somewhat aligned with what Trump's trying to get them to agree to.
Well, I think the vision is this. If he can, and the order is important, the sequencing matters a lot, and it's really difficult when you get random events like this, India, Pakistan thing suddenly blowing up, etc.,
Hmm.
etc. But or the court decision in the US suddenly saying Trump's tariffs are illegal, which they're not according to the Constitution, and the empire striking back via these channels. Okay, but
Yep.
to answer the question directly, what I think he wants to do, the vision is, if you get Team West agreeing, look, we've got our own internal differences, and they're significant in some cases, but the larger issue is China. They're the ones that are really destabilizing the global economy, which they are. Larry Fink was saying the same thing by any other name. Okay, if all of us are together against this, we can force China to change, and the answer is they can, because they're the G7, the G, whatever you want to add on top, big emerging markets, collectively they can either make China say, right, well, we'll have an empire of like 3 or 4 different countries, an economic empire, not a physical one.
Hmm.
And this is our sphere of influence, which is not enough for them. Or they'll have to recognize, right, everyone's going to put tariffs on us like the US. Everyone's going to say, right, we won't absorb your excess production. We have to look at some kind of internal reform now to absorb more of what we're producing domestically, which cannot do anything other than reduce those imbalances internationally and therefore domestically. But what China is hoping is that the US will just argue with everyone else. They can play all sides against each other. And that if everyone isn't united, everyone will have to default back to the current game plan, which is
Right.
China, for example, controls rare earths without which you can't make planes or high tech stuff or automobiles or military stuff. But I think everyone recognizes that's not a sustainable status quo if you don't want to be on the wrong end of the Phantom Menace, and it's not even very phantom. It's right there in front of you.
Right. And things like that, which, the world let China take that lead, but it's not that all rare earths in the world lie within the Chinese borders. They've developed the ability to refine them and create the magnets and all that stuff, but that can be replicated. It may take years, it may take a lot of investment, but it can be that advantage can be taken away from China. So let me ask you this larger question, then, Michael, which is, okay, so let's say that happens, right? So Team West, eventually has their kumbaya moment and they apply pressure to China and China agrees to whatever concessions Trump wants them to. What does that do to the ascent of China here? Does it defang China's future prospects and really keep them from becoming the next great global counterbalance to America? Or does it slow them down only a little or not at all or what?
Well, here's the irony. On one level, it shouldn't make any difference. And on the other level, it's enormously important because, in terms of not making any difference, you would just be saying, we're not trying to stop you growing. We just want you to grow through consumption rather than overinvestment and overproduction, which you send to us.
Mhm.
So you're just growing via a different mechanism, which means that the Chinese, in theory, albeit with a lot of friction in terms of the transition they would have to go through, would be big consumers. You'd have tour groups of Chinese everywhere spending on things. or at least at home, buying lots of stuff from the rest of the world, which is what everyone dreamed
Right.
would be the case. And for years I said, dream on. Right? That's not how it's going to work.
Yeah, that
But
is
that
Team
would
West
be,
dream, but you're saying get
yeah,
used to
in the same.
disappointment. Yeah.
Well, exactly. The problem is that from an ideological standpoint within China, that makes you reliant on others. That means that you don't have the ability to then turn around and say, well, if you do X, we'll do Y, and suddenly you can't make A, B, or C. It means them disarming to a large degree at a time in which they're actually arming themselves to the teeth, just like America is, or America's trying to, but not able to actually
Yeah.
produce as much for the buck as China does. So it's a big leap of faith. And ironically, while we're talking about this neo-mercantilism, we're talking about either the empire or rebellion, depending on which side of the ideological camp you see it. We are talking about a change which ultimately makes China more of a cuddly panda,
Mhm.
if you will, rather than one with sharp claws and teeth. So there are lots of kind of dichotomies and ironies within this process.
It's going to be just fascinating to see how this plays out, and obviously super complicated. It's going to take a long time, a lot of flux between now and then. So, Michael, we'll have to just have you keep coming on a regular basis to keep us updated as this thing unfolds here. Um, let me just because we're running short of time here. Let me switch to lightning round with you. Um, what do you I think what are you watching most closely right now, or in terms of like the year ahead, right? Not 5 years out, 10 years out, kind of the shorter term, with the headlights of your car can at least vaguely show you in this murk that we're traveling in. What do you think is most likely to happen? Like what are the things you're watching closely, and what do you think are their most high probability big events in the next year?
Okay, well, the primary one for me at the moment is that Middle East issue, because you've got Russia and China, North Korea and Iran, a couple of others standing behind them who are really buddy buddy against Team West. If you can manage to get a deal of sorts done in the Middle East, and again, big question marks over that, big, that would be an enormous geopolitical win, which starts to change the chessboard because you've actually made a breakthrough in one particular area. And as I said, then Europe and Russia cancel each other out, and then America can pivot towards Asia, and things look important. Things look much better for America on that front. So the Middle East matters, and equally, if things go off the rails and you get Israel bombing Iran and oil prices go to $200, that's a very different equation, right? So that matters most to me right now, short of any other surprises on the geopolitical front. And then in the background, all the rumors that you are now going to see about what either side will offer or both sides will offer ahead of a double barrel state visit, US China, because that matters absolutely enormously. I can't believe both sides will visit the other without anything being agreed.
Yeah.
And yet I have real difficulty seeing what either would agree to at this particular moment. So
Yeah, unless
it's
we have some new Zelensky moment, on the world scale, which would be awful. But
yeah, it could be, but I mean, we really are like in a 1945 end of World War II atmosphere where you had
okay,
FDR, Churchill, and Stalin
and Stalin,
meeting
yeah,
in different places, including in Tehran. By the way, there was a meeting in Tehran, which is an interesting parallel
super interesting.
to decide who gets what, where, and when, and
Yeah.
that is what I'm watching most closely.
Okay. Well, look, as those happen, once we know what happens in those, again, I'd love to have both those events be triggers for you to come back on and kind of make sense for it of us in real time. Let me ask you, sort of relative to your answer there. There are a lot of people over the past couple of years who have said, look, America is it's losing its ability to drive unilaterally world events, and what's really going to be the counterweight to that in the new future is going to be the BRICS alliance and whatnot. And you and I have talked about your skepticism of that. I mean, I'm a little skeptical, but I don't have the insider knowledge that you do as someone who lives outside the U.S., has spent time in Russia, has analyzed China for a lot of your career. Um, you just talked about, hey, if America's able to kind of strike this deal, in the Middle East and kind of de-escalate things with Iran, um, how strong of a counterweight do you really see that coalition being? Because, a lot of those countries have not had, they've had checkered relationships with one another, over the decades and centuries. And there's still opportunity for America to be striking deals in some cases with almost all of them. And if they can do a deal with Iran, they can do a deal with Brazil. They can do a deal even with China.
Completely. My view is that once America gets Team West on side, um, and for all the low point within Team West at the moment, it's still much higher than anything within BRICS overall in terms of the practical day-to-day stuff on the ground. Then yeah, they can try and make these sidebar deals. There'll have to be a lot more carrots than are being offered at the moment. The White
Yeah.
House is not offering any carrots, just lots of sticks. But you start offering a combination of the two, and I think some things can change. The only thing will be very hard to break apart is Russia-China. I think Russia-China really are weighted at the hip or joined at the hip at the moment. Excuse me, mixing my metaphors. Joined at the hip, and the US wants to try and break that apart. That's one of the reasons why they're pulling out of the Ukraine war. But even if they do, that Russia is aware of the fact that Europe is still going to keep fighting, and Europe will buy American weapons to do it. So I don't see that one breaking apart.
Yeah. And talking about the Atlantic Alliance, yeah, relations are probably more strained with America and Europe than they've been in a while. Trump obviously didn't make many friends in Canada, over the past 6 months. Um,
No.
and understandably, I mean, first off, when you're changing the status quo, nobody likes it, right? If you're benefiting from the status quo, you don't like it, right? Now, Trump also has a very, you know, rough way of treating people, and I think, you know, very fairly, you can say he said a lot of things that were probably very unnecessary to these people, or at least put it in ways that were unnecessarily unkind. Um, that said, when you look at kind of the grand game and the needs and the desires of all the major players, is there any real reason to worry about a real severing of these longstanding relationships, with the European American Atlantic Alliance, or are these just, couples counseling issues that will get resolved as time goes on?
I think it's 50-50,
Really?
depending
Okay.
on geography, because on an underlying level, everything should go back to normal. If you look back to when we had the whole 2003 freedom fries spat, are you with us or against us?
Hmm.
Look back to the Vietnam War, which was very, very divisive between most of Europe and the US, for example. Uh, we've got through all this before, and logically, we should do again. But it remains to be seen, particularly in Western Europe, not Eastern Europe, not Scandinavia. They're on board pretty much, with Team West. They understand living next to Russia where their real support lies. But in Western Europe, up until post World War II, there wasn't really that relationship. There was, tension with the US. There was
Hmm.
competition in many areas. And it's only post World War II that Western Europe really had that deep rooted familial bond. And if you don't have common interests anymore, if you just have points of competition, which isn't a given, but which could emerge, we'll see. We'll see whether that holds up. I would like to think it will, particularly because in the European context, if that's your focus, Europe does understand and sometimes vocalizes, but it tries to keep it low volume, that the entire continent risks splitting over this issue, east-west, again, but with the East looking to America and the West saying, well, we can do our own thing, um, and they don't want that. So ultimately, what's the compromise? Well, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, interesting. I will say I'm not shocked that you didn't give it a 99% like you did the trade deals, but I am shocked that it was as low as 50-50. So let's hope it doesn't go below, go below that. But regardless what happens, one more vector to have you come on and update us on as major world events dictate. All right. Well, look, as we wrap up here, Michael, you are not an investment advisor. You do not give investment advice. Feel free not to feel free to yeah, just punt on this question if you want. But as you look at the friction that may be required to make progress on the world front, you know, all these different players' interests over the next year or so, um, does it make you more or less bullish on the markets? And if you're willing to go there, are there any general themes of things you think will benefit from the world's pursuit of increased mercantilism from here? Like, oh, these type of industries might get more favored than these types.
Okay, so on the first one, let me reiterate that I think there is a complete divorce between where markets are and where the world is right now. We do not live in normal times in terms of politics, and markets still keep trying to pretend we live in normal times for markets. So everything that I describe fundamentally could be true, and markets can do something completely different. I fully recognize that fact. But the underlying logic that I see still says, yeah, there's huge volatility ahead, and a bit further big shocks to come. I think the next big one will be when markets realize that all the daydreaming that they're doing, that this all isn't real, wears off again, and they realize that it really is real, and we're actually moving towards, the next policy shift from the White House, which will be, just as disruptive. And as I said, that can mean trade deals. Like, we've done trade deals, we've achieved some of what we wanted, but guess what? We're narrowing those imbalances. So those financial flows will change, those distributions within the economy will change with it. That's success. We've achieved our target. It's not just angry tweets day in, day out, and on, off, on, off. We got where we wanted to go. Oh, I don't like it. So that's something to consider. And in terms of the don't like it, if you've got a government, and I mentioned it already, I'll repeat it again, that keeps saying we're about Main Street, not Wall Street, you can either say they're a liar, because that's what most politicians say, and I get that, that's valid. Or you can look at the broader spectrum of policies that they're trying to push and say they actually appear to mean it. And it's entirely up to you whether you want to believe that or not. But if they do, how one structures one's portfolio, not just within the equity space, but within the broad range of assets, really needs to shift. Because, okay, again, not giving any trade recommendations at all here. The easy thing to do would have been to say, for example, I want to buy anything associated with Elon Musk. How did that work out for you in the last hour and a half?
Right.
Last 2 hours when I'm talking to you, right?
Yeah.
A lot of
By the way, for
volatility.
those, yeah, who knows where it is when this thing goes live, but Tesla's down almost 20% today. Yeah.
Exactly. So look, that could be reversed if everyone hugs and makes up. But just trying to say this person or this company is close to MAGA may work to a degree, but it still makes more sense to try and look at the structures in terms of what structurally needs to happen. And in some cases, that can mean, we understand that there needs to be the equivalent of a sovereign wealth fund or an investment bank, which is going to channel cheap liquidity to X. But it also means, and again, I remember saying this to you in November, so I have to hammer that point home again. Don't just make the lazy assumption, and it is an easy, lazy one, that this sector, like something musky, will do well because it's close to Trump, because actually you will get those frictions emerging between Trump and them. Either it's a personality clash like this, or it can be, I don't want you making a 30% return on that. I want you making far more products and making a 5% return. I want more stuff and less profits.
Right. And that's pure mercantilism, right?
That's
And
pure mercantilism. That's how
yeah.
mercantilism works. It's not all about the ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. It's about the pulling the levers of a machine, actually making more things. They ideologically see stuff as power, and money comes from stuff.
Right. All right. So these are great caveats. Let me ask you this. Does it make sense to at least start from a position of what does the mercantilist entity want to achieve? And then say, okay, I'm going to start looking at those sectors first. And let me give you a couple of good examples. If AI really is the next arms race between the superpowers, right? Then energy might be a really big space because we've got to manufacture the electrons that the AI needs to perform, right? So that might be a good starting point. Then you might need to ask yourself, okay, what might the mercantilists do to windfall profits in that industry, right? Maybe they come in, right? So yeah, folks can't see it, but
Exactly.
Michael is saying exactly with his finger.
Exactly. The easiest way to describe it as a quick takeaway at the end here is think like a mercantilist, which does involve doing a bit of reading about them. Again, I'm happy to share the report that I wrote so people can read it at home and have a think about it. But then think what's downstream of that. Let's say, for example, America needs new bridges everywhere. That's not going to be a money making bonanza for bridge makers or bridge builders necessarily, because it needs the bridges because it's existential to produce more stuff. Who is on either side of the bridge? What might flow entirely independent of any White House dreams from one side of the bridge to the other? What's the second, third order benefit to America Inc. from having that bridge? That's where you look.
That is great advice. All right. Well, look, Michael, I am so appreciative that you've given us so much of your time already, given the work I know you got to get to right now. And I'm sure half of your brain has just been spinning this whole conversation saying, oh my gosh, what am I going to say the second I get off here? So anyways, thank you so much for all of this. So for folks that have really enjoyed this conversation and would like to follow you and your work between now and the next time you appear on this channel, where should they go?
Well, first of all, for Rabobank clients in the business sector, there's Rabobank Knowledge, which if you Google our work comes up there. Some of my stuff is on LinkedIn. And of course, my X handle is at the michaelevery, all one word. And that's a venue that I use for discussing these things until Donald Trump shuts it down in anger.
Okay, exactly. Which may happen sooner rather than later if he and Elon don't patch stuff up soon. All right, Michael, when I edit this, I will put the links to those up on the screen. Folks will also put them in the description below this video. Michael, you mentioned the report, which I'm sure folks would be interested in reading. Two things. One, can you just give people the 10 seconds on what's in the report? And B, is it all right with you if I share that report with people over at thoughtfulmoney.com slash I'll do thoughtfulmoney.com/every. That's easier to spell. So do you mind if I direct them to that URL to get your report?
Please do. You have my full permission. And the report, 10 seconds. I try and show logically where Trump sits in the pantheon of past neo-mercantilists and how they thought and how they acted so that you can predict what he's likely to do. Because as I said, they don't all do the same things. They act differently in key regards. So if you can box tick, boom, 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 yep, this is the pattern that Trump is copying, you can predict which policies might come next and then what happens.
All right, super useful insight. So obviously, folks, if you're interested in getting that, again, go to thoughtfulmoney.com/every. Folks, please express your gratitude as well for Michael giving so much time with with us on such a busy day. Let him know that by hitting the like button and then clicking on the subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. I'm sure many of your heads are spinning, thinking, oh my gosh, how do I try to invest in this type of world that Michael has so convincingly laid out for us? If you're one of those people whose head's spinning like that, highly recommend that you talk to a good financial advisor who understands and takes into account all the macro issues that Michael have laid out for us here and can help you put together, a reactive and custom tailored portfolio strategy, and then can help execute it for you. So if you've got a good one who's doing that for you, great, stick with them. If you don't, then consider scheduling a free consultation with one of the ones that Thoughtful Money endorses. These are the firms you see with me on this channel week in and week out. To schedule one of those free consultations, just go to thoughtfulmoney.com, fill out the short form there. Only takes you a couple seconds to fill out. These consultations are totally free. There's no commitment to work with these firms. It's just a service they offer to be as helpful as they can. All right, Michael, I cannot thank you enough. If you don't mind, I will give you the floor to say whatever parting bits of advice you have to say to the just regular people, regular investors who are watching this and trying to learn, but also trying not to become collateral damage to this friction that you mentioned may be happening between the great powers going ahead.
Keep calm and carry on. Everything that we're seeing now, we've had versions of it in the past. So just a little bit of research can make you feel much more comfortable thinking this isn't unprecedented, it isn't unknown, and there are paths through it.
Very well said. Said like the sage man you are, as well as a Brit. Keep calm and carry on, my friend. Look forward to seeing you here again on the channel as soon as your schedule allows.
Likewise, thank you.
All right, and everybody else, thanks so much for watching.